morning she walked into Hargrove and Associates with her 4-month-old daughter strapped to her chest. Elena Voss had not slept in 36 hours. Not because the baby kept her up, though Mila had her moments, but because Elena had spent the night sitting at her kitchen table, reading through every document her attorney had sent over, making sure she understood every single line before she signed anything. She'd learned her lesson about trusting other people to read the fine print for her. That lesson had cost her 7 years and half of what she'd built. She adjusted Mila's weight on her chest before she pushed through the glass doors. The receptionist looked up. Her eyes dropped to the baby. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Elena Voss, Elena said. I have a 9 o'clock. 3 years earlier, she would have described her marriage to Chandler Voss as good. Not perfect. She wasn't naive, but good. Solid. The kind of marriage that looked the way marriages were supposed to look. The brownstone in Back Bay, the dinners out, the vacations they almost always took. Chandler was the kind of man who remembered to open car doors and forgot to ask how she was doing. She had thought, for a long time, that this was simply the way things settled when you'd been together long enough. She had met him when she was 26 and working as a junior associate at a commercial real estate firm in Boston. He was 34, already running Voss Capital. Already the kind of man who walked into rooms and made other people shift slightly to accommodate him. She'd been drawn to his certainty. He had an answer for everything. She had been at an age when that felt like strength. What she hadn't understood yet, what took her years to understand, was that certainty and confidence were not the same thing. Chandler was certain. He was not, as it turned out, particularly confident about anything that required him to be vulnerable. She stayed at the firm for 2 years after they married. Then Chandler asked her to come work with him. It wasn't a conversation so much as a presentation. He laid out the numbers, the equity stake, the vision for where Voss Capital was going. She was good at what she did. He knew that. And so she left the firm and moved into his world, which eventually became their world, which eventually became the only world she knew. She was not, in hindsight, sure when exactly she had stopped noticing what was happening. The thing about being betrayed by someone you trust completely is that the evidence is never where you expect it. It's not a lipstick stain or a strange receipt. It's smaller than that. It's the way someone stops reaching for you in bed. The way they answer a question you didn't ask. The way they laugh at something on their phone and turn the screen slightly. Not hiding it exactly, just angling it away. Elena had noticed those things. She had filed them away in a part of her mind she rarely opened. She was 34 when Mila was conceived. Chandler had been distant that entire fall, distracted, working late, going quiet in the middle of dinners. She had chalked it up to the Meridian deal, a $200 million acquisition he'd been trying to close for months. When she told him she was pregnant, he hugged her. He said all the right things. She wanted to believe him so badly that she let herself. By December, she knew. She didn't know everything, not yet. But she knew enough. She found the hotel receipts while looking for a parking validation he'd asked her to grab from his jacket. Room 408 at the Langham. 4 nights. October. The week he told her he was in Chicago for a conference. She stood in their kitchen, holding the receipts for a long time. Then she folded them carefully, put them in the inside pocket of her own coat, and started making a list. She didn't confront him. She knew herself well enough to know that confrontation would only give him the chance to shape the story. She'd watched him do it in business. Get ahead of a problem, control the narrative, make sure everyone else was reacting to his version of events. She wasn't going to give him that. Not this time. She found an attorney named Margaret Holt, who had been recommended by a friend of a friend, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of woman Elena needed in her corner. Quiet, thorough, and absolutely without sentiment about any of it. Margaret listened to everything Elena told her, asked sharp questions, took careful notes, and then said, "Good, you came to me early. That matters." Over the next 3 months, Elena built her case. Not an emotional case, a financial one. She had been at Voss Capital for 5 years. She had restructured their investor relations, rebuilt their portfolio management systems from the ground up, and personally overseen the due diligence on 11 acquisitions, including Meridian. She had a paper trail. She had emails. She had board presentations with her name on every slide. She also, as Margaret had advised, quietly gathered documentation on the assets that were technically in Chandler's name alone. The properties, the accounts, the offshore structures he'd never bothered to explain to her, because he'd never thought she was paying close enough attention. He had made a fundamental error in judgment about his wife. In March, when she was just beginning to show, she told him she knew. She kept her voice even. She told him she wanted a divorce, and that her attorney would be in touch with his. He went pale. He said things. She doesn't remember all of them now, only the texture of them, desperate and scrambling, and nothing like the certain man she had married. He asked if they could talk about it. He said it didn't have to be this way. She said, "I'll see you at the settlement." Then she walked out of the room and called her mother. Mila was born in June. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, dark hair already, which surprised everyone who knew Chandler. Elena's mother flew in from Phoenix and stayed for 6 weeks. Elena's friend Phoebe, who had never liked Chandler, a fact she was gracious enough not to mention more than twice, brought food every other day and sat with Elena on the porch while the baby slept, and they both pretended to watch the garden. "How are you doing?" Phoebe asked one evening. The question was careful. "I don't know yet," Elena said honestly. "I think I'm still in the part where I'm just doing things." Phoebe nodded. That part's important. It was. Elena was grateful for it, actually. The logistics of a newborn left very little room for grief. You fed the baby. You changed the baby. You walked the baby at 2 in the morning up and down the hallway in the dark. And somewhere in the middle of all that relentless necessity, you kept moving. She had always been good at keeping moving. What surprised her in those early weeks was how clearly she thought. She had expected to feel wrecked. She felt sad, yes. She felt angry in the low, banked way she'd been angry for months. But underneath all of it, there was something else, a kind of clear-headedness she hadn't expected. As if getting out from underneath the weight of pretending had freed up some part of her brain she'd forgotten she had. She used it. She reviewed every document Margaret sent over. She made notes. She asked questions she would not have known to ask a year earlier. She learned, in those late-night reading sessions with Mila dozing in the bassinet beside her, exactly how Voss Capital had been structured, exactly what her contributions had been worth, and exactly what she was entitled to claim. The numbers were not small. Chandler had retained a firm called Brecker & Lowe, which was the most expensive family law firm in Boston, and which specialized, as far as Elena could tell, in making things complicated enough that the other party gave up out of exhaustion. She had anticipated this. Margaret had anticipated it more specifically, which was why she had spent the better part of 4 months making the paper trail impossible to argue with. The first round of negotiations went nowhere. Chandler's attorneys offered her a settlement that was, as Margaret put it with admirable restraint, not serious. Elena declined it. Chandler's team made it known, through intermediaries, that Chandler was willing to be reasonable if Elena was willing to be reasonable. Elena found this characterization interesting. She had been, for 7 years, the most reasonable person in their marriage. She had been reasonable about his travel schedule, and his work hours, and his moods, and his particular way of walking through a room, as if no one else's time quite mattered as much as his own. She was done with reasonable. She counter-offered with a full accounting of her contributions to the firm, documented and time-stamped, attached to a claim for equity that made Chandler's attorneys go quiet for 2 weeks. 2 weeks after that, she got a call from Margaret. "They want to move this to mediation," Margaret said. "In person." "Fine," Elena said. "He'll be there, I know." And apparently, a brief pause, "He's bringing someone." Elena looked down at Mila, who was asleep in the bouncer on the kitchen floor, one fist curled against her cheek. "That's his choice," she said. She didn't tell anyone she was bringing the baby. Not because she was trying to make a statement, or not only because of that. Mila was 4 months old and still exclusively breastfeeding, and her mother had gone back to Phoenix, and Phoebe had a deposition that morning she couldn't reschedule. There was no one to leave her with. It was simply the reality of her life, the same way it had been the reality of her life every day for 4 months. Mila went where Elena went, because there was no other option, and Elena had stopped apologizing for that about 6 weeks in. She dressed carefully. A charcoal blazer over a silk shell, dark trousers, low heels, comfortable enough to stand in, polished enough to mean business. She wore Mila in the structured carrier she'd bought when the baby was 6 weeks old, and which had at this point logged more miles than most of her shoes. She did her makeup the way she'd done it for investor presentations, clean, precise. Nothing that would read as trying too hard. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked, she thought, like exactly who she was, a woman who had built something significant and was here to collect what was owed to her. The baby against her chest was not a weakness. She refused to let it be framed that way, even in her own mind. Hargrove and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a building on Federal Street, with windows that looked out over the financial district and a conference room that was clearly designed to make everyone in it feel like serious money was at stake, which, Elena supposed, it was. She arrived 7 minutes early. Margaret was already there, standing by the window with a coffee she hadn't touched, reviewing something on her tablet. She looked up when Elena walked in, and her expression didn't change. Margaret had an extraordinary poker face, but her eyes went briefly to Mila and then back to Elena with something that might, in a different woman, have been a smile. "You look prepared," Margaret said. "I am," Elena said. They sat down on their side of the table. The mediator, a trim, silver-haired man named Hargrove himself, which Elena had not expected, came in and introduced himself and began the standard preamble about the process. Elena listened with one hand on Mila's back, feeling the slow rise and fall of the baby's breathing. She heard the door behind her open. She did not turn around. She heard voices, the flat, professional murmur of Brecker and Lowe, and she heard Chandler's voice beneath them, saying something low that she didn't catch. She heard a second voice, a woman's, softer. She still didn't turn around. Then Chandler walked around the table, taking his seat on the opposite side, and he looked up and saw her. She watched it happen. She had not, until that moment, known exactly what she wanted from this. But she understood it now, watching the careful composure fall completely off his face. It wasn't cruelty she wanted. It was simply for him to understand fully, finally, without the buffer of attorneys' letters and negotiating positions, what he had done, who he had left, what he had walked away from. The woman who sat down beside him was younger than Elena by maybe 6 or 7 years, dark-haired, pretty in a careful way. She was wearing a cream blazer, and she sat with her hands folded on the table, and she was doing her best to look like this was simply a professional meeting and not the specific kind of professional meeting that it was. Elena did not blame her for trying. Chandler said, "Elena." His voice was strange, thin. She said, "Chandler." Mila chose that moment to stir, making a small sound, and Chandler's eyes dropped to the carrier and then came back up to Elena's face, and she could see in real time the math he was doing. She had told him, months ago through Margaret, that the baby was here and healthy. She had not sent photos. She had not provided more than the minimum required by their legal process. He had known in an abstract way that he had a daughter. He had not apparently understood what that meant until this moment. He started. "Mila," Elena said. "She's 4 months old." The woman beside him, whose name Elena knew from documents, was Rachel Doone, who had worked in Chandler's PR department for 2 years before Elena had found the Langham receipts, looked at the baby. Something complicated moved across her face. Hargrove cleared his throat. "Why don't we begin?" The mediation took 4 hours. Elena had expected it to be difficult. It was. In places, Chandler's attorneys were good at what they did. They were precise and thorough, and they knew how to make things sound reasonable when they weren't. They kept coming back to the idea that Elena's contributions to Voss Capital had been supportive rather than operational, a distinction that their argument required. And that was also, Elena knew, completely false. She had the documentation to prove it. Margaret walked through it methodically. The restructured investor relations program that had brought in $47 million in new capital in its first year. The portfolio management system Elena had built out that had increased their reporting efficiency by 30%. The due diligence framework she had personally designed and implemented. She had emails from board members complimenting her work. She had memos. She had her own compensation records from before the marriage, when she had been, by any measure, a significant professional in her own right. Brecker and Lowe pushed back. They tried reframing, recategorizing, minimizing. Elena sat through it with her hand on Mila's back, and she let Margaret handle the legal argument because that was what Margaret was there for. But twice, when Chandler's attorneys made claims that were not simply aggressive but factually wrong, Elena spoke up. Quietly, specifically, with dates and figures, and the patience of someone who had spent 3 months doing nothing but prepare for exactly this conversation. The second time she did it, Chandler looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger. Something more like recognition, as if he were seeing, clearly for the first time, the person he had been married to. She found she didn't particularly need him to see it, but she was glad, anyway, that he did. Around hour 3, they took a break. Elena stepped out into the hallway and found a quiet corner and fed Mila, while Margaret stood a few feet away, giving her space and also, Elena suspected, making sure no one from the other side wandered past. When Mila was done and settled again, Elena leaned her head back against the wall for a moment and closed her eyes. Phoebe texted, "How's it going?" Elena typed back, like a business negotiation, which I guess is what it is. "Are you okay?" She thought about it. "Yes," she typed. Actually, yes, she meant it. Whatever she had expected to feel in that room, grief, maybe, or rage, or the particular specific heartbreak of seeing the man you built a life with sitting across a table with someone else. She had felt some of those things, briefly, in the first minutes. And then the meeting had started, and she had been too focused to feel anything other than focused, which was, she thought, the best possible version of herself she could have brought to that table. She had not cried. She had not raised her voice. She had been, in the truest sense of the word, prepared. When it was over, they had not reached a final agreement. That wasn't the point of mediation, Margaret had explained. The point was to establish what each side was actually willing to accept before they got into the expensive wilderness of a full trial. But they had moved significantly. Chandler's attorneys had, by the end, stopped arguing that Elena's contributions were supportive rather than operational. They had stopped a lot of things. Hargrove closed his notebook and said something neutral and professional about next steps. Everyone stood. Chandler's attorneys began gathering their things. Chandler himself didn't move immediately. He was looking at Mila. Mila was awake now, blinking at the ceiling with the mild curiosity of a 4-month-old encountering a new environment. She had one hand loosely fisted against the carrier strap, and she made a small sound, not a cry, just a sound, the way babies do when they are processing the world. Elena watched Chandler watch his daughter. She had thought, for a long time, about what she would feel in this moment. She had expected it to hurt more than it did. What she felt instead was something almost like clarity. A very clean, very still awareness that she had done the hard thing, and the hard thing was almost finished, and on the other side of it was a life that was going to be, against all the odds of the last year, genuinely her own. "Elena," Chandler said. His voice was different than it had been at the start of the day. The thin, careful professional tone was gone. He just sounded like a man. "She's beautiful," he said. Elena looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. She picked up her bag. She nodded to Margaret. She walked out of the conference room and down the hallway to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. And when the doors closed, she was alone with her daughter and the city outside the windows and 4 months of the hardest work she had ever done. And she breathed. Phoebe met her outside. She was standing on the sidewalk in her work coat with 2 coffees from the place on the corner. And when she saw Elena come through the revolving door, she held one out without saying anything. Elena took it. They stood there for a minute in the cold air, not talking. "So?" Phoebe finally said. "Good," Elena said. "It went well. Define well. We're going to get what we asked for. Not all of it today, but we're going to get it." Phoebe let out a slow breath. "Good," she said. "Good." Mila made a sound. Phoebe looked down at her, and her face did the thing it always did when she looked at the baby. This involuntary, almost embarrassed softening. "Hey you," she said. "Were you in there the whole time?" "She was very professional," Elena said. Barely said a word. Phoebe laughed. It was the first time Elena had laughed in 2 days, and it felt like something loosening in her chest. Something she hadn't even known was tight. They walked toward the parking garage together, and Elena told her about the mediation in the careful, selective way She'd learned to tell stories over the past year, keeping the facts, leaving out the parts that still had edges on them, because those parts she would process on her own time and in her own way. What she told Phoebe was this: she had walked in prepared, she had said what needed to be said, and she had walked out with her daughter and her dignity in the beginning of a fair settlement. What she didn't say, what she was still figuring out how to say, even to herself, was how it had felt to sit across that table and not feel small. For years she had organized her life around Chandler's certainty, his vision, his version of who they were together. She had been good at her work, and she had loved her work, and she had still somehow let herself be gradually reduced to the person who made his world function. She had been so busy being indispensable that she hadn't noticed she had disappeared. She was not going to do that again. Whatever came next. The finalized settlement, the apartment she'd put a deposit on in Cambridge, the freelance consulting work she'd already quietly begun with 2 former colleagues. She was going to build it herself on her own terms, with full knowledge of every single line in every single document. She was 35 years old, and she was starting over, and it was, in the truest and most complicated way she knew how to mean it, going to be fine. The settlement was finalized 11 weeks later. Margaret called on a Tuesday afternoon while Elena was at the park, Mila in the stroller, the late October light doing that thing it did in New England, where everything went gold for about 3 weeks before it was gone. She answered on the second ring. "It's done," Margaret said. Elena stopped walking. Around her, leaves moved. Mila was awake, watching a dog go by with the intense focus she brought to all new stimuli. "All of it?" Elena said. "All of it," Margaret said. "The equity stake, the portfolio credit, the property settlement. They took the full offer." Elena stood there for a moment. She thought she might cry. She didn't, quite. What she felt was bigger than tears. Something that didn't have a good word for it. Something that was part relief and part grief, and part of very specific, bone-deep pride in herself for having done this the hard way and done it right. "Thank you, Margaret," she said. "You did the work," Margaret said. "I just knew where to put it." After she hung up, Elena stood in the park for another few minutes. The dog had stopped at a bench and was being petted by an older man who was talking to it very seriously, as if they were having a conversation. Mila was still watching them with her characteristic solemnity. Elena reached down and rested a hand on the edge of the stroller. She thought about the woman she'd been 7 years ago, 26 years old and new to the city, and so certain that certainty was the thing to look for. She thought about all the small moments when she could have paid different attention and hadn't. She thought about the kitchen floor with the folded receipts and the long night at the table with the legal documents and the conference room on Federal Street in Chandler's face when he saw his daughter. She didn't regret it, not the marriage, not even most of the years. She had learned things she couldn't have learned any other way. She had become, through the process of losing a version of her life, someone she understood better than she ever had before. But she was done with that part now. She was ready for what came next. She tucked the blanket more securely around Mila's legs. She turned the stroller toward home. The light was still gold. The dog was still being talked to very seriously. Somewhere in the financial district, in a building on Federal Street she would probably never enter again. Someone was filing the paperwork that made it official. Elena Voss walked home through October in Boston, and she let herself feel every single thing she felt, and none of it was small, and none of it was something she would have traded, and she was against the odds and against the losses and against everything that had tried to make her smaller than she was. She was free.